Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my hosts, Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Bruce Gilley. He's a professor of political science at Portland State University and the author of a new book, The Last Imperialist. It is Sir Alan Burns' epic defense of the British Empire. There you go. Pick it up. Came out in September. We're going to talk about this book and all things colonialism. But first, Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
And I want to start, I'm assuming as you did, before the book, with a little article you wrote back in 2017 that raised some ire and some feathers. And it was the case for colonialism. And we'll get to the arguments that you made and whether we agree or disagree. But what made you write that, and then talk about what happened when you tried to release it?
I guess two things made me write that. First of all, when I was in grad school and doing political science, I was noticing that every time someone did some statistics work and they were trying to explain this or that, they always put in a variable which was like, was this country part of the British Empire? And the reason they did that is because if you were part of the British Empire, we all knew that you were probably more democratic, richer, your human rights record was better. And they all just kind of dismissed that as like, okay, yeah, we need to like put that in there. But that's not interesting. We're really interested in other things. It always surprised me that they were kind of just like putting that aside and saying, well, of course we know if you're part of the British Empire, you have a better democracy, your standard of living is higher, your women's rights are better, your infant mortality rate is lower. But nobody was really like paying attention to it. Meanwhile, if I walk across campus to the Black Studies department, they're all down with colonialism, and there was something weird about that. Like, well, is it like because over here, the modelers are telling me that like this was great. So that was one. The other thing is then I picked up the last book written by Chinua Achebe, who's the great Nigerian novelist, wrote Things Fall Apart, and it's called There Was a Country. And Chinua Achebe, in his last novel, his last book, it was a personal memoir, basically says like British colonialism was good for Nigeria. The British ran Nigeria better than we've run it, and we need to sort of think back about like what they were able to achieve and how we can kind of get back to some of that, that rule-abidingness, some of that meritocracy, some of that sort of pluralist society. And that was a shock to me because if you know Achebe, he's seen as this kind of pantheonic figure of anti-colonial resistance, right? But here he is in his last book. And then I went back and read everything about Achebe, and actually he was never anti-colonial, right? So his whole like persona had been misrepresented by the academy and by activists. So that's what really prompted me to say, okay, let's think this through. Let's look at the data. Let's make the argument. What is the argument? Partly just to kind of see what would happen if I made that argument. And I guess it's kind of like one of those children's movies where like they're playing around with gunpowder and it kind of blows up in their face.
And talk about blowing up. You got a reaction obviously from it, right? What happened when you thought you were just going to publish this normal piece, make a case? It was peer reviewed. Everything was fine. What happened when it was published?
Well, I mean, I published it in a journal that kind of takes itself as being anti-colonial in its DNA. So there's a little bit of problem there. I think for some of the members of the editorial board, the editor himself has always been curious and kind of willing to publish things from different perspectives, and that's why he published it. So the editorial board was in an uproar. Then, of course, there was petitions around saying shouldn't have been published. It's an act of hatred. It's a this, that. It's Holocaust denial. Yada yada yada. And eventually, the editorial staff in London was getting death threats, and so they said to me, "Look, we can't retract it because we're subject to the publication ethics rules in the UK. You can't retract something because people don't like it. You could retract it if there was an error, if it was fabricated." And I said, "Okay, well, you can withdraw it. which is different, right? Which basically I'm saying withdraw it for other reasons. So it was withdrawn and then republished in another journal. And it's kind of been like my sort of calling card ever since.
So before we get to what the thesis was and the book, I want to ask Shamika and Will, what was their first thought when they saw the premise, right? The clear, right up front case for colonialism. I'm going to start, I know, but we'll get to the political scientist. He's going to have a longer answer. So I'm going to start with Shamika. What was your thought?
I went into it with the open mind. So I think I'm actually still on the fence because I see his points, but I don't know if I agree that, you should just kind of like your way is the right way. If somebody should just be like, okay, this is the way it should be. And this is,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know if I agree with that, but I did look at it with the open mind. So I'm excited about really hearing the case and hearing more.
Well, that's a good thing because it can be one of those things where the best way they do things, they'll have those, the Federalist Society does those things. So they'll bring you in, poll the audience, and what do you think of this issue? And then they'll debate it, and then they'll have you vote again at the end. So we'll come to you at the end and see if you have a pitchfork or if you signing on some, proverbial dotted line and say, sign me up. Will?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, one thing that the good doctor here mentioned that I think is really common in the academy, when I argue online, or for that matter in my academic work, and I'm sure he's had the same experience, academia is very heavily left. It's about 93 to 7 left to right. So people will often ask, are you just dismissing all of these people that are over here on the left side of the fence? Do you think they're a bunch of quacks? Do you think they're a bunch of cranks? No, I think there's some fascinating, writing from a Marxist perspective about classism in society, so on. A lot of it's wrong, a lot of it's nonsense, a lot of it's quite good. But the problem is that the other 60 or 70% of the questions just aren't being asked. That's the real issue. So when, Dr. Gilley, I mean, when you mentioned that there's this variable, I've used it, post-Brit status, I call it P-Brit in models, that everyone employs because the British Empire stabilized so much of the world, and no one talks about in the context of whether colonialism was good or bad. Omissions like this are very common. Just very quickly, if you're looking at papers trying to measure whether the police are racist or not, in the niche I sometimes write in, you find that they disproportionately shoot black people every time if you don't adjust for crime rate. If you adjust for crime rate, you find that they are not racist at all in every paper, as Roland Fryer demonstrated. I've written about this, so on down the line. So this, again, I think is just an example of if you had more diversity, more people from foreign backgrounds, more conservatives, so on in the academy, you wouldn't find people totally dismissing what we've seen before, although we'd get rid of a lot of it, but you'd find people asking different, obvious questions. So, I mean, my reaction to the paper, I'll say openly, I think colonialism was in some cases a good thing, some cases a bad thing. I don't understand why white woke people generally think of colonialism only in terms of white people. All of history has been a history of conquest. I mean, up until maybe 1550, the stereotypical colonizer would have been a smart brown man waving a sword and, spurring his horse toward Europe. There's a force called something like the Turkwood outside of Vienna because they lost so many battles to the Turks, the Ottomans, that they reached the gates of the damn city. So colonialism is something that's gone on throughout time. Ottoman colonialism probably increased income, frankly, in a lot of Eastern Europe. British colonialism, even better. But it is a tough thing to debate. My comment on this, I'll have to reread the paper. I've read it before in my professional capacity. But it seems like it's just an empirical question. I mean, if you're looking at something like income or Gini, the coefficient that measures income inequality, or women's rights is the obvious one when you look at rival societies like Islam or East Asia, either that's better in post-colonial societies or it's worse on the average. I mean, that's just a crosstabs analysis. I would say more often than not, it's probably better. The last caveat for me as a black man, though, I will say that's British colonialism. You'd also have to look at French, Portuguese, Italian, so on colonialism. And there really is probably a fascinating picture there that, again, no one's exploring because it's so much more interesting to Mao the white man.
Right. Well, since you both kind of teased to it, I'm going to have Bruce just go into his case. But I'm going to agree with Will and disagree with Will on something slight. I agree. And we've talked before about this whole colonialism is just white and they just ignore any other conquest. And I joke to, like I said, bring this together for normal people our age to understand it. We grew up, everybody said, watch Roots. And then they had the movie of Shaka Zulu. And all the black people were like, yeah, Shaka, I love Shaka. Shaka was, man, he was tough. It's like, yeah, Shaka was like killing people and raping and pillaging. So we celebrate it based on the color and the construct of the people who are doing it. Somehow he was great and others weren't, but he was just doing, like Will said, like everybody does. But the other thing, he said that it was more of an imperial question. And I don't think, we'll swing it back to you, I don't think your case was an imperial question, because you make some, we'll get into whether we agree or not. You started with a question, just empirically, but you went to, this is what I think we need. And one of them is, not to bury the lead, is we need more, we need colonialism now. We might need to start one, or we need to bring some back, right? So, tell us about the premise.
Well, I want to, point out sort of what you point out and what all three of you have pointed out, which is, look, colonialism is the norm in human history. Every society has been colonized by others. Before the Europeans arrived in Africa, all of Africa was under colonial regimes. So if your argument is, I don't think it's good to say it's my way is best and your way is wrong, then absolutely. In which case, all of African pre-colonial regimes, which were empires, the Ashanti, the Uganda, the entire Bantu migration to the southern Africa that displaced all the Khoisan groups, and then later claimed these were like our ancestral homelands. I mean, the Fulani slave Sokofa in northern, what's now Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon. I mean, most of Africa was under colonial regimes before the Europeans. So if your argument is, it's not right to say our way is better than yours, and so we should rule you, I couldn't agree more. In which case, what do you do with Africa under these very illiberal, very tyrannical regimes? So the question isn't, do you want to be under an empire or not? The question is, what sort of empire do you want to be under? Because that was the concrete choice for most African peoples. And so when you look at why the European empires spread into Africa, it's because they were displacing other empires, right? They were almost always displacing other empires. So that's one thing that is really important to keep in mind. Right? There was no self-governing, autonomous, democratic, liberal, human rights abiding countries in Africa. They didn't exist. Right? They were empires, hierarchical, patriarchal, misogynistic, slave trading empires is what existed. Second point is, and just sort of the reaction to my article, right? All the criticism was from white film studies professors in American universities, right? And the only responses I got from the former colonized areas was positive, right? Whether it's from people in India, people in Africa. I've made so many new friends in Africa, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Kenya, people in the Caribbean. And their argument was, what's the big deal? We have these debates all the time over the kitchen table. How come these people went ballistic? I mean, not that I'm saying we all agree with you, but having this kind of discussion is like, you guys in America discussing whether the New Deal was a good use of federal resources. I mean, it's just like an everyday argument. Why are they thinking this is some big, shocking, Holocaust denial? And I think the two things are really important. First of all, what was there before colonialism? Really important to know. And then secondly, that, much of the criticism of my article was not from, it was these white film studies professors saying, oh, I need to protect the black and brown people of the world from reading your article because it's going to make them feel unsafe and traumatized. And then I get these actual black and brown people in the third world saying, what? Who's this white film studies professor telling me what I'm allowed to read about my own history?
Right. No, that's totally true. To put a point for some of those who talked about, like Will saying that this is the norm everywhere and that what was there before. And you're going to talk about, obviously, as we go through the book and the article, when you make the case, the good things that they brought. We can talk about the bad, and we can bring those up too. But here's a quote from one of my favorite books, We Want Equality, by me. And I go that when the Hindu priest, complained, arguing it is their custom to burn widows on the husband's funeral pyre, Sir Charles Napier, Major General of the Bombay Army, said, be it so. The burning of widows is your custom. Prepare the funeral pile. But my nation has a custom also. When men burn women alive, we hang them and confiscate their property. So we want to focus on that evil white man saying, you just got to take that stuff and burn them, and ignore the part that, hey, when a guy dies, we throw his wife in on top of him and we set him on fire. And that was cool. So, I mean, there's things like that everywhere. Will's talked about the Aztecs. Everyone acts like before Europeans came to America, the Native American tribes were sitting together in the basement watching Housewives, and then these evil people came along, right? So it's even if they want to attack the bad, which we can bring up, you can't act like everything was great. So I don't know if you want to start. I'll let you decide whether you want to start with. I won't start with the bad. Let's start with the good. Because that's part of the case. It's the case for colonialism. So let's talk about what British colonialism did for the areas that they, covered.
Yeah. So, and I think that you're absolutely right that like we've got all kinds of different colonialisms to talk about, and they're not all equal. And in part, the reason they're not equal is because when you come late to the party, you get the sort of leftover chicken bones on the table, whereas the first people who got there got the drumsticks. And so, in some ways, the reason that late colonizers are worse is because they were dealing with places that no one else wanted to colonize. And then people said, "Oh, look what a bad colonizer you are," And Mary's like, "Yeah, well, you gave me a dumpster basically to colonize, so no wonder like I wasn't. You guys took all the rich pickings, and so the Portuguese get a bad rap because they were so late to the party. But it's not really fair because they were dealing with like the places that no one else wanted. So and there was a reason for that. The disease burden was very high. The entrenched slaving interests were very powerful. We didn't have to deal with that. So I focus on the British Empire, but don't forget the British Empire. If you take the standard measure of European colonialism, which is people years, so one person living for 1 year under a European colonial regime is a person, right? So that's the unit of measure, so that we can basically like have an overall view of like totality. So you calculate people years of European colonialism. The British Empire is about 80% of the total, because India itself is like 60% of the total. And then the rest of the British Empire is about 20% of the total. And then the remaining 20%, about half of that is the French, right? 10. And then the other 10 is, it's the Germans, it's the Belgians, it's the Portuguese, it's the Italians. So basically, if you make a case for the British Empire, you've basically made the case for colonialism.
Okay.
How does that tie into New World colonialism, where, essentially what happened in the New World is obviously that Spain and Portugal came over and conquered the entire entity. So Brazil was a former Portuguese colony. Right. Almost every other country in Latin America, former Spanish colony. Do you stop the analysis at the moment of independence? Because, that was where a lot of the truly bloody wars, La Noche Triste and so on, between whites, these people were all Hispanic to some extent, right, but between Europeans and Indios took place. Would you describe that as a good thing, or what would your response to it be?
No, so I'm very clear in the article that I'm talking like post-Napoleonic Wars colonialism, right? So Spanish and Portuguese, and not even colonialism, right? It's just basically conquest and claim staking. It doesn't belong in the same conceptual category as 19th and 20th century European colonialism. It's just just because there's white people showing up on the shores of brown people doesn't say, oh, that must be the same thing. It's not. It doesn't belong. No more belongs than saying we should talk about, the sort of, Vasco da Gama's voyages around the world or whatever. So, I'm very clear that I'm talking kind of 1824 is the standard cutoff point, but that's the beginning of what we call modern European colonialism.
Well, let me ask you this, Bruce, because everyone who will be watching and listening aren't necessarily historians, obviously. So they will wonder, well, why did they come? If it's different from the conquest, why were they there?
Well, because the view the view throughout history until very recently was powerful nations had a right of conquest. That was it. That was the legal status of nations was they had a right to conquest. There was no legal prohibition against conquering your enemies. It was considered the normal thing to do. To not conquer was considered a violation of international law in some ways, because your responsibility was to expand your borders. So the Spanish and Portuguese were voyages of discovery and voyages of claim staking and of just resource extraction. Right? They didn't intend to transfer their institutions. Right. They didn't intend to to govern those places in
Right.
a way that became known in 19th
Right. So I
century.
mean, like the British, the later, the 1800s and 1900s. So when we talk about that, what we know as what the British spreading their empire, they would ask, well, why were they there? And why did the others go separate from the conquest?
Right. Well, because they felt they had a responsibility to basically follow their interests, which were mainly first the missionaries were there, and then the traders were there. And once you have these missionary and trading activities all around the world, right, and being challenged by others, you feel a need to establish a governance system because the worst thing, right, was having this private colonialism going on. Private colonialism was a disaster for both the colonizers and the colonized, right? Because why? You have no accountability mechanism, right? What's to stop a company from just engaging in the most egregious abuses? And we saw that with the East India Company. We saw that with the Free State. We saw that with Liberia. Liberia was basically private colonialism by Black Americans in Africa, and it was a horrendous situation. So private colonialism was always a bad idea. You needed a public system with accountability mechanisms, with media, with civil rights, legislatures, with all that stuff. That's why they went in, because the private system was creating so much abuses that, when you get domestic uproar. What are we doing? How are we allowing this to go on? I mean, they were. The argument is they were pulled into these places more than they were sort of. Vladimir Lenin says, they were pushing out to maximize profits and deal with the need to maximize profits. It's not a historically accurate view of how these colonies got established. They got pulled into these places where the traders and the missionaries were already involved, where local tribes and chieftains were trying to find an ally to compete with their traditional rivals. It was the great argument by British historian Seeley, who said, the British Empire came into being through a fit of absence of mind. Like we didn't plan to run the world. Like we're just a little island in the North Atlantic. And just we woke up one morning and we were in charge of this vast area.
So, what to those who would say that it was done without their consent? I'm sure that would be one argument you hear.
Yeah, and it comes back to the question of like, well, is it right to sort of Shamika's point about like saying like my way is better than yours? Well,
right.
So first of all, they hadn't given their consent to the empires that have currently put them under their oppression. So consent. So there was no. It's not like they were in a consenting community to start with, right?
No, right.
And then I would say that part of what I put in the piece of colonialism is actually the consent was quite significant and strong and positive, right? And the evidence of that is not just if you look at the agreements and the treaties and but the number of white people on the ground in these colonies was vanishingly small. I mean, most Black Africans didn't know they had been colonized because they never saw a white man. Right? All of the colonial governance was done by Black people. Right? Colonial governments were run by Africans. Right? They were the police. They were the soldiers. They were the district officers. They were the tax collectors. There might be one white guy at the provincial capital, with a few rifles, but the numbers are extremely small, right, relative to population and area. And so, is that because this guy had this magical sway of threat of oppression? No, it's because basically they figured out that, hey, you know what? Our women aren't getting stolen by our rival tribe. Wage income is rising. For the first time, we have an alternative to plunder as a daily occupation. And so the consent, I mean, of course, were there referendums on do we want to be part of the British Empire? No, of course. I don't think the conditions existed. But I would say, what I've argued in the argument in the article is actually the legitimacy was quite high in the context of the situations.
Well, I think that is a hard sell. One, because people don't pay attention, don't read everything and look at it in context, which I complain about often. And Shamika, tell me about this. Am I right or wrong that whether what you said was factual or not, Bruce, that people will take that, if you took that case and put it in today's woke, which would say that, yeah, of course there were black people running everything and those people to see. Those are just people working for the man. So you get some people that are always willing to put down their own people. You pay them a little money, you give them a nice home, you let them live better than the other blacks and make them think they're a superior black, but you keep them down. And that's what, am I right, Shamika? Is that the way that they would describe what he just said?
I think they would describe it that way. And I was also thinking, I would hear a lot of people saying, that white people are just savages and all they want to do is conquer. And that's why they go throughout, trying to just take over everything. So then what would you say to that?
Right.
For one, I guess, I'm just saying when you said about being late to the party, because I was thinking, why does it seem like the brown people or the black people are always on the short end of the stick? But according to post-traumatic slave syndrome, we're always late. So then I guess that kind of answers that question.
I think that late meant the later colonizers like Italy, or the people who came late, who and to be fair, they're looking at it like, strategically, like everybody's looking at their own interest. They're like, well, Britain's there first and they're gaining, they're getting these resources, they're trading with these people. But if we just allow them to go and take over the Horn of Africa and we just stay where we are, we're a weaker nation if we don't do it. So it's almost like you get pulled into it, whether it's right or wrong. You got to live, we all have human nature. So if you're trying to do self-preservation and the only way you can preserve what's yours is to go to fight, you go to fight. So some of them just went because it was the way to maintain their level of prominence in Europe. Right, Bruce?
Yeah, and they're also just dragged into these situations that they have no intention of becoming the governors of. But there's a traitor, there's a dispute, there's a mission station, some missionaries get murdered. They send in a battalion, the battalion stays. It's very there's no kind of like evil white men sitting around a conference table in Lisbon, twisting their mustaches and drawing, black markers on the map and saying, "Aha! Let's run down with our bayonets and butcher people and take over this area." It's ridiculous. It's just a cartoonish vision. I mean, this is not how history unfolded in these situations.
Well, you're on mute. You're on mute. You're still on mute. You put it back on.
All right. So, cool. Everyone can hear me? All right. Thanks, guys. No, but I mean, historically speaking, weren't there a couple of times when that happened? I mean, there were the conferences that divided up most of free Africa. I mean, I recently read, Haile Selassie's, I'm sure, highly translated memoirs. And I mean, they discuss this idea that each European power would get certain percentages of the African continent, what was then referred to as free Africa. How does that fit into the paradigm? Because this, without rambling on too long with the question, this is one that's interesting for me. Because obviously there were people in the colonial states that would have preferred to live in them, British Kenya, for example, than in the previous state of tribal warfare. I don't think that's disputed. But a lot of European, even friends of mine today, will try to describe colonialism as what you just said. There was an incident, there was a scrap on the border, and we sent in the Highlanders or whatever regiment. We ended up staying there, and that's, take up the white man's burden. But how would you respond to that, to the fact that there were multiple situations where European countries decided which African, even if we're not talking about Latin American, set of states they would all get? But one last thing, this ties into a broader question, which is whether colonialism made a lot of money for the European powers or it didn't, right? Again, part of the argument is, we went there to help these poor people to some extent. But is that true, or were there substantial resources, rubber, gold, and so on that were exploited? What do you think? How consciously did the Europeans take over, and how much money did they make from that?
Yeah, they did. They may have had a conference like the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference was a kind of like bolting the door after the horse, bolting the door after the horse is gone already, because the things were happening on the ground so fast. That's the problem. They may have pretended they were grandly writing plans for centrally planned colonization, but that was not the reality on the ground. So what happens is scholars go and they read all these memos and diplomatic cables, and they're like, "Aha! You see, they were carving up Africa in these smoky rooms full of cigars." But okay, but because people say something doesn't mean that is a reflection of reality on the ground. And the people who studied the reality on the ground, I would direct your attention to Camille Lefebvre at the Sciences Po in France, who's looked at this very carefully, and she's like, basically they're just shooting air out of their backsides in Europe. They have no idea what's going on the ground, and nothing that they say translates into reality. So if you just, and what happens with academics is, they don't want to go and do the hard work in the Cameroons and study the reality in the archives there. They don't want to go to Lagos because it's shitty hot. The archives are inaccessible. You get malaria. So why would you rather do? Well, I'm going to go to Paris or London and sit in the colonial archives and read all these shocking letters and documents and write my dissertation, and then I'm going to be a famous academic by being outraged by what I see in these diplomatic cables. Well, those diplomatic cables had very little bearing on the reality of what was happening in these countries, right? And it's just this like faux kind of outrage about like, oh, I was forced to sit in the Kew Gardens in London for 3 months and read all these cables, and now I'm showing what an anti-colonial resistor I am. And it's nonsense, right? They don't have the guts or the interest to actually do the hard work, and if they did, like Camille Lefebvre did, they would find that the process of colonization was totally disconnected with whatever diplomatic cables were flying between Berlin and London. So that's one thing. Imperialism, total money drain, right? Total money drain. So there's the famous book called Uneconomic Imperialism. It basically shows like they would have been better to sell their colonies to someone else. They were basically penny stocks. They were worthless. They were a drain on investment. Their investment would have been much better used at home. The idea that they profited, or we can explain the British Industrial Revolution because of colonialism doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And then I just want to kind of bring it back to like a personal level. Like one of the reasons I wrote this book is because sometimes I think you need to let's tag along with something. Let's actually follow an actual person in a colonial situation. Sir Alan Burns starts in the colonial service in 1903, 1904 in the British Caribbean. He goes to Nigeria, he gets sent back to the Bahamas, then he gets sent back to Nigeria, then he gets sent to what's now Belize, and he gets sent to Ghana. He's the governor of Ghana. And everywhere he goes, right, you see a person. I mean, if he's the representative of the system, right, he's constantly struggling with like, how do we get the roads built? How do we build the education system? There's no resources, right? How do we develop a sense of national identity here? Have we documented the language here? Have we documented the religion and the culture? Like, what's their traditional view of constitutionalism among this tribe? I mean, all this stuff is going on, right? And what colonialism was doing, come back to this question about, colonialism is like imposing your way on others. No, colonialism was allowing others to be self-governing and self-realizing for the first time in their histories, right? And it's very clear that the British are the fathers of the Nigerian nation. The British are the fathers of the Indian people. The British are the fathers of the Ghanaian nation. Not because they're the biological fathers, but because they created institutions in which for the first time these peoples could articulate a genuine sense of national identity and develop a desire for self-government and desire a sense of history and culture. All of this happened in the colonial, right? And all of this would not have happened absent the colonial.
So this leads us to some obvious bads. I mean, the things that people would, if they were here in our place, that would want to ask you would be, because they will say that you're being a white and British apologist. So you have to say that there were some issues with it. So what were the downsides of colonialism, first of all?
Well, okay, so here's what I always say. So first of all, one kind of what's called like an anchoring thing, which is like, I'm trying to figure out what you mean by a word when you say it was exploitative or racist or oppressive, right? And so I say, so one of the things I always say is, okay, ask an academic, and this may not be true for other like educated people, but ask an academic, do you think the contemporary United States is exploitative, oppressive, and racist? Okay, so
yes,
their answer,
they're academics. You said ask, right? Academics, yes, they say yes.
Yeah, and they'll all say yes, right? And so I'm like, okay, good. So I understand that if a colonial situation measured up to the situation in the contemporary United States, so when you call a colonial situation racist, oppressive, and exploitative, what you're meaning is it's as bad as the contemporary United States. And then I'm like, okay, I'm done. Thank you. That's all I needed to know. So your criticism means nothing to me. I think you are a obscure kind of product of 21st century digital ignorance, and I don't really think it's worth engaging with.
Right.
So
it's like debating someone who's extreme. But what if they say, well, no, they'll probably say yes, but just say colonialism is worse. But let's say they do say, no, but this is unique and this is different. And even if I give you your argument and they came there, to save the missionaries, and then they saw, wow, there's no schools and no roads. Let's build them. Let's do this positive. You still are doing it, they would argue, with the intent that these people are struggling because they're not as good as us. We're white and we're better. They'll say we're the elite, we're Europeans, and these poor Africans couldn't survive or feed themselves but for us. And so that's why we stayed and did it.
Just to very briefly jump in here. I mean, I obviously, first of all, I think that it's good that this debate includes more perspectives than just woke people screaming at the sky.
Right.
So I mean, that is probably the most useless available perspective. I would assume that you are probably in the strongly pro-colonial camp, whereas most people would probably fall at other points somewhere along the road toward that position. I mean, I just pulled up an old piece by a buddy of mine on the Berlin Conference. I mean, there were pretty actual empirical impacts of that. I mean, Austria-Hungary, the USA, Norway. I mean, significant power players who probably could have taken colonial possessions opted not to because they thought of this as a formal division of Africa. So obviously, I mean, there would be the British position to some extent, which many scholars expressed quite eloquently at the time. And then there would be the position of revolutionaries in the colonial countries. And then I would suspect the truth might be somewhere in between. But getting to the point here, like when you say, what do you mean by the colonial systems were racist? I think it's fairly easy to answer that. Most countries until the past, 30, 40 years, were hysterically racist by our standards today. Women couldn't vote until 1920 anywhere. So, I mean, what do you mean by racist? You could simply say something like, well, in Dutch Indonesia or in British and, Afrikaner or South Africa, you had organized systems of racial caste. I mean, in South Africa...
As you did in all pre-colonial African countries.
Well, sure, but that's so. I guess that's what I'm saying.
So basically, all you're saying is human beings are racist. Which,
well, not quite.
Okay, so what's the point of that, right?
Not,
I mean,
not quite.
And the Maori were racist against the Maori. In fact, they wiped them out.
Yeah, they killed and ate a lot
of the
Samoans
were racist against the Solomon Islanders,
but
and
this
the Japanese
is a little
were different.
I think this is a little different from the initial intro, though, right? I mean, what you said is when you say racist, I'm asking you, are you saying racist as in the United States? The United States is the least racist country in the world. I mean, we're both political scientists, if I recall. I mean, everyone on the panel has pretty good background in this. I think last year Uruguay was second to us. So that's if pre-1995 South Africa were only as racist as the United States, I don't think that would be, a bill of charges against colonialism at all. But I mean, the allegation would be sort of no Indians or dogs, right? It would be that the colonials had systems of racial caste that were often modeled on those of the local lords they replaced and were sometimes a bit worse. Like, what would your response be to that?
Well, yeah, exactly. So no Indians or dogs, which of course, the no Chinese or dogs sign was of course a fabrication. So post 1949 nationalist fabrication by the Chinese, but of course, we don't, and that's been well documented. But yeah, it's like, no Indians or dogs, even if that existed, right? Well, what was before that? It was no untouchables or dogs, right? So racism and racism was never. I mean, racism is why we're all here. By the way, all four of us would not be here unless human beings had developed a sense of in-group solidarity and out-group hostility, right? I mean, that's how human society emerged, right? We emerged through the solidarity of in-group attachment and out-group hostility, right? That's how they survived, right? So racism is the default position. I mean, any society that ever transcended it is practically a miracle. So we're actually living in a pretty unusual period. And yeah, if you say, I went through this colonial governor's, his district officers like memoirs, and he keeps saying, the bloody blacks or whatever, the bloody Chinese, and oh my God, that shows that European colonialism was uniquely racist. That's a nonsense statement, right? That's a nonsense statement because if we had the memoirs of the Fulani slave lords in northern Nigeria, right, talking about the Ashanti that they had enslaved, we would, unfortunately, it was a pre-literate society, or they didn't record, or we don't have those documents, so we don't have that. So again, it's like, well, I don't really want to go do that hard work in the Cameroons. I'm just going to go sit in this nice little archive in North London and find all these outrageous racist statements from the European colonialists.
I'm going to Tamika in a second, but real quick, let me add, I think what the problem is, and I see what you're saying, it's tough for me because I constantly say almost on every episode that people lack logic and context, and that the left is trying to fix human nature and they don't want to own up to what the facts are. So a lot of that part is true. So whether I won't necessarily say all racist, but I'll say humans are flawed. So they're going to do some kind of bad. Maybe they're not racist, but they're thieves. Maybe they're murderers, rapists, whatever. That part I don't have a problem with. But what I think the problem will be, and what they'll say is the whole, equivalency thing. So you're saying you're not really defending them, as opposed to saying they just did the same thing that people did before, which most would say, and I would agree, isn't really a defense of them. You're saying, so, human nature is flawed. I agree. There were some people from Africa that had conquered another country and another tribe in Africa, and they were doing bad things. The British came in, defeated them, and they did the same thing, did a little worse, did a little better, but they did the same thing. So it's almost like, so what, they did it, so were the people doing it before. But that's not the question. The argument they're saying is, what bad did they do, not what bad did they continue that someone else was doing.
I'm with Bruce on this one, though, just to jump in really briefly. Like, he's probably right that the colonizers were almost exactly as racist as the slightly more corrupt. But, I mean, if you put, again, we had that one show where, like, you guys are just teasing me about being amoral for 10 minutes. I think a lot of that's accurate. Like, if you were to take a just cold, realistic sentence, like, the colonizers were slightly less racist than the local lords they replaced, and generally slightly less corrupt, so enjoyed a 52% approval rating among the populace, that would probably be true. Right. I don't think there'd be much dispute about something like that. I think the question then comes up with the almost uniquely Western sense of social guilt. When I talk to relatives that are Native American Indian or West African or something like that, a bit distant in the second case, but there's not really a whole lot of societal guilt. It's just sort of, well, yeah, we were fairly developed. We fought pretty well. The whites won for a period of time. That's life. Europe and America seem to have gone into a cycle of obsessive guilt. You can call it good or bad. I view it as foolish. But within that cycle, I mean, there's definitely a lot you can pull out of colonialism to feel guilty about. So I don't think that the social justice brigade would be comfortable just with, yeah, we were about as bad and we built better streets. Right. That is accurate. I'm not outraged by that, but I don't think that's going to satisfy the major critics of Dr. Gilley here.
Yeah, but Shamika wanted to say something real quick.
Now, I just had a question, and maybe Will answered it, but I was wondering, why is the thought that the colonizers needed to step in? Like, did we not think those civilizations, especially in Africa, could have become more civilized? What was the difference between, them evolving and the colonizers, I guess, having to evolve at some point in time?
You mean like evolving on their own, right?
Right.
Right.
Is there a thought that they could not, in Africa, those civilizations evolved on their own?
To add to that, Bruce, how about when they had the missionaries there and something bad happened, they came and say, all right, you came here to save souls and it went awry. So we're going to come and protect you and pull you out, but we're not going to stay and then, build roads and governments.
Yeah, again, the mistake you're making is the assumption that they imposed themselves on these societies. They didn't, right? The Brits were asked to come into so many places that they said, no, our hands are full. No, please come and colonize us. No, we can't, right? I mean, so many places in Africa and Asia, they wanted the Brits to come in, and the Brits would say no, right? We don't want to get involved. So, I mean, I just from the book, right? When Sir Alan Burns is writing about the history of the Gold Coast, right? Basically, this is what the book says: the most powerful Akan kingdom, the Ashanti. The Ashanti were the big kingdom, right? It was on the warpath when the British stepped in to save the Fanti and the Akan tribes. The Fanti and the Akan tribes asked the British to come and intervene because the Ashanti were trying to subjugate, right, and include them in the Ashanti Empire. British treaty with with the 9 Fanti chiefs of the Gold Coast in 1844 created a crown colony of 63 separate tribal states and protected the people of the colony from otherwise certain annexation by the Ashantis. That is the story of colonialism, right? No one was imposed. And in Fiji, for example, which was the British colony, they were about to be subjugated by the Tongans, right? The Tongans actually had the war canoes on the beaches. They were about to invade Fiji. And the Fijians reached out to the local British and said, would you please protect us? Because if you don't, we're going to be subjugated by the Tongans. And this is the South Pacific. They tend to do like a lot worse things to make you a slave in the South Pacific. So that's the historical reality of most of this colonialism, right? Is like, holy shit, we're about to be in a really bad situation. Okay, the Brits are probably going to be racists, and they're probably going to exploit us and make us work hard, but at least, we have a fighting chance under the Brits, whereas our historical rivals, we know exactly what's going to happen under them.
So
I think that answers my question.
That did?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
Just the thought that they said, hey, come, I'm thinking of like in today when we have these other societies that want like, America to come in and kind of stabilize their, nation because they feel like it would be better than living under the regime they're living under. So I guess.
Yeah. And then when we go, our citizens say, warmongers, you're going in to steal their oil or whatever else they have.
Right.
I guess we need to get to your book and why you talked about defending. Well, we're getting some on the topic, right? People are interested, but talk about why you wrote about it.
The book is just like the same debate we've been having, but just through the eyes of an actual person.
Right. That's what I was going to say. So why did you choose him, and what does and obviously he was the last imperialist, and he did all he could to defend the empire. So what was it about him that made you write through his eyes, and what was unique about the way he tried to defend the empire?
Well, I mean, he's a legendary kind of British colonial official in the British Caribbean, in Central America, in Africa, and in Fiji as well. And the thing that struck me about him is he is so loved by the peoples where he worked, right? And he's kind of legendary, almost like a totemic figure. And this is a great story about in the 1960s, his brother's grandson was in Canada at University of British Columbia in anthropology class. So you can imagine what an anthropology class in the 1960s at the University of British Columbia is like, right? It's just like woke up the kazoo. Anyways, there's a Ghanaian woman in the class, and he goes up to her, his great nephew basically goes up to her after class and says, hey, I hear you're from Ghana. My great uncle was actually the governor of Ghana, last year. And of course, she flips out. She's like, well, that's disgraceful. You should be ashamed. You're related to a colonial oppressor, right? So she goes back for summer holidays to Ghana, right, and tells the story to her family. And they dream her out, right? What do you mean? This guy, Sir Alan Burns, was the best ruler we've had, in the last 50 years. We loved him. He cared so much. He did so much for our country. You go back and apologize to him, right? Which she did, right? She goes back and apologizes. So, what attracted me to him is he's so clearly a person who, whatever the debate on colonialism and big, historical debates, we can have that forever. We're never going to solve that problem. But there is no doubt that this man did his best and tried his hardest and brought joy and development to the places he lived. There's just no doubt about his particular individual impact. And, to me, it's sometimes more powerful to make a story and make an argument through the life of an individual than to try and get into these big historical issues.
So, what do you want people to know about British colonialism that they don't know?
I think what they need to know about British colonialism is that it was a system that worked and gave voice to the places that it colonized, right? That it was literally the mechanism through which these places became nations, not just in terms of the formal institutions and becoming states with flags and postage stamps, but places that saw themselves as Nigerians. I mean, the whole concept of being a Nigerian didn't exist until the British came and said, look, we need to think of ourselves in a civic way. We need to just like in America, we have a multicultural state, but we need to think of ourselves as Americans. It's the basis of a flourishing democracy. So I think the story through his life is that's how the British system operated. It came in, it was self-defeating to start, right? I mean, when you go in and you start creating education and elected legislatures and the rule of law, you know that the end game is going to be they're going to turn on you. Great. You know what? That's the long-term plan anyways.
So how do they find that stuff out? Because, if they go to their professor in their high school and college history classes, they ain't getting what you're talking about. Even if I'm saying, like Will was saying, a lot of people somewhere in the middle of this super pro-colonialism, or it was all evil, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But how do we get the truth when they're never going to teach anything you or anything like you, and they're only going to give us, they all went in and raped and pillaged. So where do they go? What are some resources that they have that they can find out a little more and find out if you're telling the truth?
Yeah, well, there's a new organization in the UK called History Reclaimed, and I think it's doing a great job on this issue. So History Reclaimed is a place I would turn to stuff.
Okay. And then I don't know if you two want to mention that. I got to go back to your article, because we were talking about colonialism, good and bad, what you're saying, why it wasn't as bad, how it's been misrepresented. But I was really just struck by the part. It's like, I will go further, like I said earlier, and say what we need now is a little bit more. We need something today to fix some of the ills in the world today. Colonialism is what we need. So talk about
when remember the explosion in Beirut port, when that warehouse full of seized Russian fertilizer.
Yeah, right. Oops.
Went up, right?
Yeah.
So a week after that, someone put a petition asking the French to come back for 10 years.
French, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's a French.
It was a French mandate, right? Lebanon was a French colony.
Right, but have they seen France today?
Well, yeah. Well, so the French had stayed involved. They were a French mandate from 23 to 43 for 20 years. Anyway, so this petition gets thrown out there almost as a joke, right? It's 600,000 signatures in the first day, right? And Macron shows up the next day for a visit, right, and says, no, we don't want no, I'm not in the colonialism business. We're supposed to be apologizing for it, but basically then he kind of creates a sort of system. They attempted to try and get some order to that place, right? But it's not ridiculous for people whose governments have failed them time and time again, who are forced to flee if they're not starving to death, to say, maybe a little bit of international help is not such a bad thing. And maybe we just need to get over this, oh my God, it's colonial. Maybe we just need to get over that, because, if we care about human lives, why are we so concerned about the labels that are attached to this? Let's focus on bettering human lives.
So where would you do it? Where's the place, the second place we would go?
The French said we're going to create a new political pact. The Germans were going to run the airport.
I'm saying if someone read your article and said this makes sense, some places need some form of colonialism. What in your mind? What would those places be?
It just means being more open to countries, whether European or not, right? Because there's a lot of countries like, I think, India and in the Gulf states that have a lot to share, to be open to the possibility of bringing them in to help you rebuild and reignite your government and your development, right? And that's not such a big deal, right? I mean, the South Koreans basically run a small colony in Bangladesh, and it's a great, just a vibrant and powerful source of development in Bangladesh. Of course, you don't read about it in the New York Times because there's no white people, right? So who cares if it's like Koreans colonizing the South Asians, because they're not white people. So they're all focused on white supremacy. So
there's actually a pretty
basically
important point there with
and
China and Africa as well.
Oh, go ahead, Will.
Yeah. No, yeah. I think there's, again, colonialism probably wouldn't be the selling language that I would use for that as the head of an international organization. I think at some level, everyone that's active in international politics that is not an idiot has had this idea. I mean, and if you just Google Akon city in Africa, just a silly example, but you'll find dozens of pieces about white or black American billionaires being asked to come into the continent and develop sort of high-tech zones within major African cities, so on down the line. I think in reality, anything like this would be much more diverse than the most recent round was. I mean, one of the things you're seeing, I said jokingly on Twitter the other day that people better get ready for that new Chinese Nigerian super race.
I was going to say, yeah.
I was looking at some IQ data, and I noticed that there are massive Chinese populations of settlement in sort of stable West Africa. It's not a joke.
I was going to say that. I'm like, China's already there.
Yeah, no, I mean, so that, to some extent, I mean, I guess the point has been made by all of us that that's something that is ongoing to some extent. You see that from the Arab world, so on down the line. Beyond that, I guess the one question would be, I think what Charles asked is, where do you see this taking place? If you wanted something like multiracial corporate armed rescue, MARK, or whatever, of certain troubled locations, what would be your first couple of choices?
Well, I mean, it's happened, right? The British, Sierra Leone brought the British back in to rebuild their police force in the 2010s, right? And it was explicit. It wasn't a like aid or consultations. It was, we are handing over sovereignty of our police force to the Brits, right? And it was a 5-year program, right? And Sierra Leone were thrilled, right? Because their policemen were just a bunch of corrupt crooks, right? So they came in and they rebuilt it. So it's happened before. You see little snippets of it. I mean, you're right. Everyone says to me, Bruce, just don't use the C word, right? Just find a euphemism for it. And I'm like, okay, I guess. But beware, if you use a euphemism rhetorically, you're always vulnerable to someone saying, aha, that's colonial, right? So you're kind of opening yourself up to criticism that you need to face head on, right? Which is sometimes, if you can get a wealthy, well-governed country like India, like South Korea, even China, I think, the things it's done in Africa, if it's always compared to what's the alternative, right? And I don't think that's a bad thing. And if we care about human lives, and if we care about creating the foundations of allowing these places to be self-governing and flourishing, that's the route. And I think there's lots of little examples going on. I don't think we've yet got to that paradigm shift where people are thinking this has got to be the way going forward.
Well, I want to leave with this. You were talking about Beirut and talking about 600,000 signatures. And speaking of signatures, when your book was coming out, you had some signatures to not get your book published, right? And what made me think about that is that you are a professor. I thought about it at Portland State. And there's an interesting, well-known fellow that Will has invited on the show that has had some issues out there. So I'm wondering, with a book like this, how are you surviving at Portland State?
Yeah, that's why I live in a
cell, in a prison cell.
Yeah, this is why I stay in a walled bunker. Yeah.
Undisclosed location. So how is the campus life for a man who's defending colonialism?
Well, it's like I say. Look, our students are often working class, first generation students. They love being in class. They are curious. They are grateful to their professors. We have no problems. We don't have the trust fund babies that you get at Yale. So basically, on our campus, it's the film studies professors and gender studies professors that give us problems. But it's actually, I consider myself lucky to be at a small state school rather than at an Ivy or at a Massachusetts liberal arts college where the entire world professoriate and student body would be asking for my head.
Yeah. Shamika, one last word on colonialism. We talked at the beginning. You had some reservations and some things you like. I'm going to hold out. The man presented his case, and white man good, white man bad.
Well, I do feel like when it comes to colonialism, there was some savagery and maybe control freak-ish stuff going on. Mm-hmm. But when I think about, would I rather be here or somewhere where my clitoris would be removed, I have to then say I'm grateful for it because it has served me well, and I'm glad I'm in a place where I get to keep it.
And we're not throwing you on a pyre after your husband dies, see? So there's some pluses and minuses. You might have to work for a little less, but I don't know. So it'd be interesting to see the comments on this one. He is Bruce Gilley, the author of The Last Imperialist, Sir Alan Burns' Epic Defense of the British Empire, and political science professor at Portland State University. Bruce, thank you for joining us.
Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the U.S. of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.